Hi, my name is Heather Grantham. I am the Director of Deaf Education Studies in the Program in Audiology and Communication Sciences, or PACS. The role of a teacher of the deaf can be varied depending on the setting in which she works. Typically, we say that teachers of the deaf can work with children ages birth through 12th grade, and that's an enormous age range to train for. So what we do in our program is we work with new budding teachers, and we teach them all about what happens when a child is born in the hospital, is screened for hearing loss, and if the diagnosis is present, then we have what we call early intervention coursework, where we teach students how to work with families, how to work with other professionals such as audiologists, cochlear implant specialists, people who are working with families in those first very crucial months of life. And so deaf educators can work with those families all the way up through the child enters preschool. And then from that age 3 on, deaf educators work with children who are in preschool settings, then school settings, and all the way up through high school settings. The teacher of the deaf can work, as I mentioned before, with children ages birth through 12th grade. But you might wonder what that really means. And the teacher of the deaf on any given day can be in a school setting. We can start with the school age group. And a teacher might be working in what's called a self-contained classroom, which is where she has all deaf children or all children who have hearing loss. And that looks more like what you might expect a traditional classroom to look like. This can happen in a public setting, it can happen in a private setting, it could even happen in a state school for the deaf that is more of a residential setting. However, the vast majority of children aren't served in these self-contained classrooms. The vast majority of children who are deaf are served actually in general education settings where they're included in mainstream classrooms most of the day with hearing peers. And so most teachers of the deaf actually are called itinerant teachers, which means they travel. And you might expect that that means the teacher of the deaf basically lives out of the trunk of her car. She doesn't have a classroom per se, but she goes from child to child, sometimes building to building, or even from school to school within a district, and works with children on a caseload. So imagine, for example, that a teacher might have 15 children on her caseload. Each one of those children has a different set of needs. Each one of them has a different number of minutes that they are served by the teacher of the deaf. And each one of them can be working on things like speech, language, vocabulary. Most of the time, those are the 3 big things that teachers are working on, but also self-advocacy. So for example, you might think about a 7-year-old who wears a cochlear implant, who also uses an FM or a DM system, which is basically just a little personal microphone system that wires sound from the teacher's voice directly to the child's device. And if you have a 7-year-old that has all this great equipment, you can imagine that it's really hard to manage sometimes. So the teacher of the deaf would work with that 7-year-old to make sure that he feels comfortable describing things like, my battery is dead, I need to go to my backpack to get my battery. I can't hear you, teacher, when you turn your back to me when you start to write on the whiteboard. Please don't put my desk near the air conditioning system because it's very loud and causes a lot of noise. And when we do group work, make sure that you give the FM microphone to all of my friends in the group so that I can hear their voices clearly, not yours. So the teacher of the deaf is working to help that 7-year-old advocate for him or herself, because there will come a time when that's his job, not the teacher's job. There can be a number of individuals that serve families. Many children who are deaf are born with hearing loss and have no additional disabilities. But about 40% of the population, it's estimated, has additional disabilities that are concomitant with hearing loss, in part because of the reason why the hearing loss was caused in the first place. So there are children who have Down syndrome who also have hearing loss, children with cerebral palsy with hearing loss, children with significant feeding and swallowing issues who also have hearing loss. So the teacher of the deaf, particularly in early intervention, must work on a team with a number of different professionals. Probably the most important professional that a teacher of the deaf works with in the early years, but all the way up through school age, is the audiologist. And so not surprisingly, teachers can't do their job if a child isn't able to access spoken language. Other professionals that teachers often work with have to do with general education professionals, so not surprisingly classroom teachers who are not special educators, but also occupational therapists and in some cases physical therapists. Another close tie is a speech-language pathologist. So it's an enormous team, and teachers are used to working on teams. So special education law demands that teachers of the deaf work on teams with others. It's part of the beauty of our special education system that teachers are obligated to be a part of these wonderful groups that serve a child. So interprofessional education is something that just comes very naturally to us as teachers. We know that we are never the only person who has the opportunity to interact with a child who is deaf. We know that there is a whole group of people behind that child.